Hello! Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Gladys Ramirez. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Norton Museum of Art, and I'd like to welcome you to our first live streaming panel discussion as part of Art After Dark. While the live Art After Dark series is on hiatus, we're still partnering with artists, curators, and performers to bring our community together virtually on Friday nights. You can find the rest of this month's virtual Art After Dark programming, as well as more information about the works of art discussed today at norton.org/artafterdark. Tonight's panel invites curators and historians of Chinese art to discuss works created to encourage a stand against injustice, a relevant discussion to our times now. We invite you to participate in the conversation as well by submitting questions through Zoom's question and answer feature. You can find the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen down here. On behalf of myself and the Norton Museum of Art, I would like to extend our gratitude to our panelists for sharing their time and bringing their knowledge and perspectives to our conversation. Joining us this evening are Philip K. Hu, Curator of Asian Art at the St. Louis Art Museum, Hou-mei Sung, Curator of East Asian Art at the Cincinnati Art Museum, Joy Lidu Yi, Associate Professor and Curator of Chinese Art and Archaeology at Florida International University, and Amelia Chau, Adjunct Curator of Asian Art at the Crocker Art Museum. And now I'd like to introduce you to our host for this evening's program, Laurie Barnes, the Norton Museum's Elizabeth B. McGraw Curator of Chinese Art.
Thank you, Gladys, and I'd like to thank all of my co-panelists for doing this as a special favor to me. I'm most grateful to you, and I owe you one. In recent months, I have become increasingly concerned about social and racial injustice in our nation and in the world. Since lessons from the past can serve as analogs to the contemporary scene, I challenged myself to search for a work of art from China's past and look into what was happening historically at that moment in search of solutions. I also called upon my friends on this panel, who are curators of Asian art, to join me in presenting a Chinese work of art that is an agent for raising social and political consciousness. In the process, I have become more convinced that all of us have a duty to examine ourselves, to commit to not standing on the sidelines and charting a personal course of growth and change, thereby becoming an agent of hope in our world today. Thank you. I would now like to invite Philip Hu to introduce the first work of art.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Laurie, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be part of tonight's program. Tonight, I will share with you one of my personal favorite paintings, and this is a painting that you see on the screen now. It's not very big. The height of the painting is only about 12 inches, and the width of it is maybe 16 or 18 inches wide. So not a very big painting, but one that has stuck in my mind ever since I studied about it in art history, and also had the opportunity to actually see the painting with my own eyes in its home, which is now at the Osaka City Museum of Fine Arts in Osaka, Japan. This painting is a very famous work of art for any of us that have studied Chinese art history, especially the history of Chinese painting. And certainly if you focus on the history of the Yuan dynasty and its art, you will almost certainly come across this work in textbooks everywhere. The title of the painting, as we know it now, is called Ink Orchid. Very simple title because that's precisely what it is. The depiction of a very simple orchid plant painted in ink monochrome on paper. The painting, although it looks really simple, actually contains a lot of deep meaning for the artist in particular when he painted it, as well as for us now, as we look back and reflect on what the artist was trying to tell his friends at the time, and to tell us now that the painting has survived more than 700 years since he painted it. He painted this in 1306. But first of all, let me give you a little bit of a background on the artist. His name was Zheng Sixiao. This is not the name that he was born with, but a name that he gave himself as a kind of style name, as Chinese artists often do. Literati artists often do that. They give themselves a style name called zi in Chinese, and then they also give themselves fancy names called sobriquets or hao in Chinese. So Sixiao was actually his one of his style names. The artist was born in 1241 in Fujian province on the southeastern coast of China, across the straits from where Taiwan is now. He became a student at the Imperial Academy of the Southern Song Dynasty in Lin'an, which the city that is now the modern city of Hangzhou in Zhejiang province. The Southern Song was actually the remnant part of a much larger Song dynasty, which had lost much of its territory in the north to the conquering Jurchen armies of the Jin dynasty. And the Southern Song retreated to the south and established its court in Lin'an, or what is now Hangzhou. So that's where the Imperial Academy, or sort of the National University, was located. So Zheng, the artist, was obviously a very educated man, because you had to be very literate in order to pass all the examinations to even enter the Imperial Academy. It was the Harvard of its day, so to speak. In any case, in 1279, when Zheng Sixiao was about maybe 37 or 38 years old, the Southern Song dynasty fell to the invading Mongols from the north, which had also subsumed the Jin dynasty in the north and finally conquered the Southern Song as well. So this was a major shock to all Chinese people of the time, because never in Chinese history had the entirety of China's territory been overtaken by a foreign people. In this case, the Mongols from Mongolia in north of China proper. So it was a major blow to the psyche and to the also to the everyday life of people in the south, because the Southern Song remnant population, or the loyalists, as they called themselves, was subject to a lot of discrimination from their new Mongol rulers. They were barred from many of the highest positions in the land, even though they were qualified for it. And so many of these people, like Zheng Sixiao, who were very well educated, were left in the lurch. But at the same time, people like Zheng Sixiao also were determined not to serve the Mongol dynasty, which they considered as illegitimate rulers of China, and refused to serve them in the civil bureaucracy. So it was a two-way street. They were discriminated against, but they were also taking a stand against what they felt were illegitimate rulers. So the painting that you see here was done in 1306. This was more than 30 years after the fall of the Southern Song to the Yuan Mongol dynasty. And still, the painting actually contains very, very strong personal feelings that the artist wanted to express. Now, when he was asked by people of the time, why did you paint an orchid painting like this without the earth below it or without roots? He's known to have replied, well, look how our soil has been taken away by the foreign rulers. So that was his sort of analogy of the rootlessness of the remnant Southern Song population having their roots taken away from them. And the orchid is also an expression of literati values. It's a very simple plant, but has a lasting, subtle fragrance. It is very modest, it's not a showy plant. It often grows in the shadows, but when it blooms, it has this beautiful fragrance that you can appreciate. So the plant itself stands for literati scholars, such as Zheng himself. Zheng Sixiao, the name that I mentioned, he changed when he was in his 30s. The name Sixiao actually can be read to mean thinking of the Zhao. Zhao was the family name of the Southern Song imperial family. But what Zheng Sixiao did was, the last character Xiao, he dropped off the radical part of that name Zhao and only left the right side of the character, which we pronounce as Xiao instead of Zhao. But for those who know the Chinese language, this was actually a kind of hidden meaning. If you knew it, you saw what he was trying to say. In addition, he also gave himself a sobriquet, or a kind of a fancy name called Suo Nan Weng, which translates into English as the old man who sort of points to the south. Again, here is somebody saying that he is pointedly thinking about the lost Southern Song dynasty. And the artist, we are told, refused to ever sit in a chair facing north towards the Mongol capital in Dadu, which is present-day Beijing. He refused to do that as a kind of protest against the foreign rulers. So you can see that in such a simple painting, there's embedded a very deep meaning of personal protest. Now, although the artist did not sort of actively go out and fight against the Mongols, his protest was from a literary and an artistic point of view. And he really expressed it in this wonderful painting. And I think this painting can be understood as one of the key examples of what would become known as literati painting in China. Literati painting, the essence of it is to project art that isn't necessarily about verisimilitude, that is likeness to what the real thing is. It's not meant to be representational. Literati painting is meant to be imbued with the personal feelings of the artist. And this is what this painting does. Also, by using only ink on paper in these very fluid, beautiful calligraphic script style, you can see the sort of scholarly character behind the artist, who obviously was able to write beautiful calligraphy as well. If you look to the upper right of the painting, you'll see several columns of a poem that he wrote, in which he signed Suo Nan Weng, the old man who looks to the south. And then on the left side of the painting, there's a small 2-column inscription where he gives the date of the painting. It's the 15th day of the first month of the Bingwu cyclical year, which corresponds to 1306. What's interesting about this small date section is that Zheng Sixiao has completely omitted any reference to the Yuan dynasty, because typically when Chinese artists date their works, the name of the dynasty comes first, followed by, or a reign period at the very least, followed by the cyclical date, the month, and the day. So by leaving out any reference to the Yuan, he is again kind of stopping time in his own way. And to him, he is still on Southern Song time, 30 years after the Mongol conquest. So that's how deeply this person, this artist, felt about the people that were ruling over him. But he expressed this beautifully in this simple and lasting work of art. So thank you very much. And now I'll turn you over to my colleague from the Cincinnati Museum of Art, Hou-mei Sung.
Hello. Hello, everyone. This is Hou-mei Sung. And like Philip, I'm going to share with you Yuan Dynasty painting. This painting depicts doves and pear blossoms and was painted by Qian Xuan. Qian was an accomplished scholar and painter of the Song Dynasty. In 1279, in his 40s, Qian witnessed the collapse of the Song Dynasty and its replacement by the Mongolian-ruled Yuan Dynasty. Under the discriminative Mongolian rule, Qian renounced government service and dedicated the rest of his life to poetry and painting. In the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongolian policies discriminated against the Chinese and favored the Mongols. Although the depiction of doves and pear blossoms first appeared in the 10th century, Qian transformed the traditional subject into a new expression. In the Song Dynasty, Chinese frequently referred to doves calling as a prelude to spring rain. In the Agricultural Society of China, spring rain, which is essential for the growth of crops, had long been associated with blessings from heaven and thus complimented the ruler. The ruler is known as the Son of Heaven. So here we see how Qian was consciously playing with the flattened patterns, the faded shades of Qian's subdued colors, the deliberately compressed images of the doves, and the equally unrealistic pear branches. All evoke neither the vitality of spring nor the lyrical mood associated with spring rain as seen in song works of the same subject. Apparently, Qian was no longer interested in the realistic depiction of flowers and birds of spring. Instead, he chose to use this traditional subject to portray his state of mind as he confronted the alienation and isolation of his life as a Song loyalist. Both Qian's choice of this subject and his personal rendition of it were laden with layers of political and social meanings. Dove, as a traditional emblem of peace, expresses Qian's wish for peace and relief from the destruction of constant warfare. The faded blossoms and the doves calling for spring rain serve as a metaphor for Qian's yearning for the return of a benevolent Chinese ruler. Qian's creative expression of his frustration and indignation when confronted with the discriminative rule may help us gain a broader perspective of racial injustice, which existed in every culture and every country throughout human history. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand it over to Laurie.
Thank you, Hou-mei. Next slide, please. This painting was created as a social and political tool between the years of 1600 to 1644, when Ming Dynasty China was riddled with corruption and faction-ridden politics. Thanks to Hou-mei's work, published in her book, Decoded Messages, this work has been identified as a late Ming Dynasty court painting by a professional artist created to encourage scholar officials to be courageous and advise the emperor on issues requiring rectification in order to strengthen and stabilize the nation. A Ming scholar identified paintings such as this as the phoenix, representing a righteous official, calling toward the sun, representing the emperor, surrounded by birds representing the 5 Confucian relationships: ruler to rule, father to son, husband to wife, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. The 100 birds also symbolize the 100 walks of life, or the whole world. The mythical phoenix is separated from the other birds and stands on top of a rock in the center of this composition, which is approximately 8.5 feet wide by 7.5 feet high. The streamlined arrow-like profile of the male phoenix directs the viewer's eyes to the sun. The artist is calling on government officials to petition the emperor for changes that would benefit people, particularly with regard to widespread corruption and oppression of the poor by the powerful rich. Next slide, please. The last 3 emperors of the Ming Dynasty, which lasted from 1368 to 1644, had lost confidence in their ability to address critical issues. They were surrounded by eunuchs and officials who, for the most part, were primarily interested in maintaining power for personal gain. The name of the most impeccably moral and fearless civil servant of the Ming Empire, Hai Rui, who lived from 1514 to 1587 and was of the Muslim Hui ethnic minority, was evoked in the hope that other courageous officials would arise to bring about much needed change. Hai zealously campaigned against fiscal malpractice and landlords' exploitation of the poor. He was forced to resign as his firm stand on fighting corruption induced loud complaints from many of his unprincipled colleagues. He lived in retirement for about 15 years before he was again called back to serve another emperor. Hai is revered as a symbol of justice in Chinese history. Later stories from his life were recounted in famous novels and dramas, including Hai Rui Dismissed from Office, written by Wu Han, a historian and deputy mayor of Beijing in 1961. Critics interpreted this play as an allegorical criticism of Mao's Great Leap Forward by Defense Minister Peng Dehuai in 1959. According to this interpretation, Hai Rui is Peng, and the Ming Emperor is Mao. Peng, who was dismissed from office, himself agreed with this interpretation. In a letter to Mao in 1962 requesting a return to politics, Peng stated, "I want to be Hai Rui." Peng briefly returned to government service in 1965, only to be arrested and imprisoned in 1966. He was physically and psychologically tortured during the Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 1966 to 1976. He died in prison in 1974. After Mao died in 1976, Peng's old ally, Deng Xiaoping, emerged as China's paramount leader. Peng was one of the first to be posthumously rehabilitated in 1978. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Lidu Yi to introduce her chosen work of art.
Thank you for joining us tonight. This evening, we'd like to invite you to a remarkable, next slide. Thank you. To a remarkable, thought-provoking, art piece called Tianshu, a book from the sky, by the acclaimed Chinese artist Xu Bing, who spent over 2 years, created and invented, printed more than 4,000 words that nobody can understand. Initially, this work was called a mirror to reflect the world. However, because he created those caricatures, that nobody can understand or read, then people call it a book from the sky. Tianshu in Chinese means illegible, cannot be understood. It's Greek to me, like we say here. So from then on, it's called Book from the Sky. This remarkable book consists of hand printed scrolls in the format of traditional Chinese paintings, and 126 volumes of hand-bound books. The caricatures are in the Song Dynasty font style. What makes this piece is so interesting is that you can see those volumes of books are actually put on an altar to show our or his, Xu Bing's reference to traditional Chinese characters. It also creates a sense of sacred feeling. It gives you a tranquil sense when you walk in. But uniquely, when the audience, the viewers, are lured to examine or try to read those characters, as we can see in next slide. When we are trying to read those characters he invented, they look very familiar because they are taken from the components of traditional Chinese characters from the Kangxi dictionary. They look familiar, but nobody, whether you're Chinese, you're Westerners, regardless where you're from, what your culture background is, nobody can read it. And those beautifully hand-bound books, as we can see on the top left, they have no meaning. So the fact that Xu Bing spent years and through a lot of efforts to create these volumes of hand-bound books and caricatures, invite or create or stimulate multiple interpretations, even criticism. And it was at the time in 1998, when it was first exhibited at the National Art Gallery in Beijing, it caused a sensation at the contemporary art world. In traditional China, the written words, the written scripts, enjoying its sacred status. However, during the Cultural Revolution, from 1966 to 1976, people's understanding of these words, the meaning of these words, changed dramatically and in a very negative way. The characters, the words, the written words became a tool to attack, at that time, intellectuals. they became a tool also to attack mouse opponents. The so-called big character posters, as we can see in next slide. Here on the top, we can see the two images reflecting, the recording what happened during the Cultural Revolution. Those big character posters were ubiquitous. They overwhelmed people politically. Eventually, these big characters, they did not mean anything any longer. Either they too may be particularly to intellectual families like Xu Bing's or my own. Those political written words eventually were meaningless. This work, Tianshu, or Book from the Sky, or the original name, A Mirror to Analyze the World, is to push the audience to reflect what the cultural heritage, the words, the script mean to us. It's a reflection of a culture, it's a cultural reflection and a mirror to echo the relationship between human beings and words. The profundity of this piece lies in multiple levels of meaning with which it engages its viewers. And we would love to hear your interpretations, your understanding of this artwork when you look at it. Thank you very much. Now, next, I'd like to turn to Amelia Chau, who will talk about the artwork by Hong Liu. Thank you.
Thank you, Lidu. Hello, everyone. My name is Amelia Chau. I'm the adjunct curator of Asian art at the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento, California. And today I am very pleased to present to you for discussion the painting that you see on the screen right now. It is titled Shoemakers, and it is by the Chinese-American artist Hong Liu. The painting is dated to 1999, and it entered the Crocker Art Museum's collection of American art in the year 2000. Looking at this painting, I think we first notice three figures, perhaps a mother with her two children, seated and bent over the humble task of shoemaking. From the way they're dressed and from their hairstyles, they look to be from the early 20th century from China, but Hong Liu has presented these ordinary people in a monumental scale. The canvas actually measures 80 by 80 inches, so the figures are indeed larger than life. Hong Liu in her work bases many of the figures on archival photographs from late 19th and early 20th century China, which often featured common folks that are forgotten or dispossessed by war. Hong Liu has given further gravitas to these figures, I think, by setting them in front of a background depicting rows and rows of seated Buddha sculptures, similar to those from the renowned Buddhist cave grottos in Dunhuang in Gansu province in China, which Hong Liu visited in the late 1970s and early 1980s. She has also layered over the figures a depiction of sparrows perched on branches of bamboo. Jeff Kelly, Hong Liu's husband and a fellow artist, once remarked on Liu's large canvases depicting women and children as refugees from war, and I quote, "In each painting, she offers her subjects the solace of their own heritage by including motifs, bird and flower, Buddhist iconography, from traditional Chinese painting." And as we learned just now from my fellow panelists, the traditional genre in Chinese painting of bird and flower can contain political and personal references. In this case, the evergreen bamboo can symbolize strength and resilience. And thanks to my fellow panelist, Hou-mei Sung, she reminded me that sparrows can symbolize ordinary people in Chinese painting. So in this painting, I think Hong Liu seems to me to be giving voice and paying respect to the forgotten figures in China's history by immortalizing them on canvas. And yet the entire image also appears to be washing away in front of our eyes. After finishing her painting, the artist dripped linseed oil all over